Simplifying your UPSC journey. Welcome to Akshar Manthan. Learn, reflect, conquer.
When the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, the consensus was absolute. State socialism had failed, and liberal capitalism had won the ideological war. But equating the collapse of an authoritarian state with the death of Karl Marx's ideas relies on a categorical mistake. It confuses a specific, flawed political application with the underlying diagnostic tool itself. Stripped of its Cold War associations, Marxism is a structural framework. It functions as an analytical engine designed to decode exactly how power is organized, how goods are produced, and how exploitation is sustained within a society. Over the course of 150 years, this engine has been continuously upgraded. It evolved from mapping factory floors in the Industrial Revolution to dissecting mass media and digital culture in the 20th century. To decode how advanced capitalism manages to survive its own internal crises today, we have to examine the original theoretical blueprint that mapped its architecture. The entire system begins with Karl Marx and his core axiom, historical materialism. Marx argued that material and economic conditions, the literal tools we use and the resources we fight over, drive human history rather than abstract political ideals. He mapped this concept into a strict architectural schematic. Society is built on a literal foundation, which he called the base. This base contains the economic mode of production. That includes the physical tools, the factories, and the inherently unequal relationship between the people who own the property and the people who sell their labor to survive. Built directly on top of that economic foundation is everything else. This is the superstructure. It holds the legal systems, political institutions, religious doctrines, and cultural norms of a society. In classical Marxism, power flows in one direction. The economic base determines the legal, political, and cultural boundaries of the superstructure above it. Down in the foundation, the system operates on friction. Marx called this the theory of surplus value. A worker labors to produce value, but the capitalist pays them only a fraction of that worth in wages, extracting the difference as profit. This creates an immediate mathematical contradiction. The system requires continuous physical extraction of value from the working class. Over time, as ownership consolidates and wages are suppressed, the gap between the two classes grows irreconcilable. Following this logic, the conclusion seemed inevitable. The contradictions built into the economic base would eventually trigger a violent revolution, breaking the capitalist system apart from the inside. This was classical Marxism, an economically deterministic model that assumed capitalism would eventually grind itself to dust. By the early 20th century, a glaring issue emerged. Advanced industrial societies were not collapsing. Instead, working-class conditions in places like Britain and Germany were marginally improving, preventing the predicted revolution. The theory required a patch. That first major upgrade came from Vladimir Lenin. He expanded the focus of the Marxist engine beyond domestic borders to analyze the international behavior of capitalist states. Lenin argued that capitalism had entered a new phase, imperialism. Mother countries avoided domestic collapse by extracting cheap raw materials and labor from foreign colonies. They exported their exploitation to keep their own workers pacified. He also recognized that exploited workers rarely build revolutionary consciousness on their own. Lenin modified the operational strategy, asserting that a highly disciplined vanguard party was necessary to force the revolution from the top down. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong faced a different mechanical problem. He needed to apply this framework to China, a largely agrarian society that completely lacked the industrial economic base Marx originally described. Mao executed what became known as the Asiatic shift. He substituted the urban industrial proletariat with the rural peasantry, making them the primary revolutionary engine. Mao also theorized that class conflict does not simply vanish once a communist party takes power. He argued for a state of permanent revolution, asserting that contradictions persist in society and require continuous ideological purges to maintain the new baseline. Lenin and Mao scaled the Marxist blueprint geographically and demographically. Yet they both still operated under the classical assumption that maintaining dominance required overt physical coercion. By the mid-20th century, Western welfare states presented a new paradox. Capitalism had reformed itself. The working class had gained access to consumer goods, and with that comfort, their revolutionary potential evaporated. Disillusioned by both the resilience of Western capitalism and the totalitarian reality of Soviet socialism, a group of scholars known as the Frankfurt School developed critical theory. Thinkers like Theodor Adorno shifted the analytical focus away from factory floors. They recognized that the new mechanisms of control were embedded in mass media and popular culture. To account for this, the neo-Marxists inverted the original architectural schematic. The superstructure is no longer viewed as a passive reflection of the economy. Instead, culture, media, and institutions are actively weaponized to control and pacify the economic base. They diagnosed a phenomenon they called the culture industry. Mass production of entertainment and advertising generates trivial, artificial desires that capitalist markets can easily and continuously satisfy. Herbert Marcuse documented this in his work One-Dimensional Man. He illustrated how hyper-consumerism functions as a societal anesthetic, reducing complex human beings into docile consumers who find happiness in commodities rather than seeking systemic change. The French philosopher Louis Althusser expanded this by mapping out ideological state apparatuses. These are institutions like the education system, religion, and the nuclear family. They operate as an assembly line for human behavior, subtly reproducing subjects who grow up believing their unequal position in the capitalist hierarchy is simply the natural order of the world. The neo-Marxist model demonstrates a transition from rule by physical force to rule by cultural programming, where the exploited learn to view their own dominance as a natural choice. If the political states constructed in Marx's name collapsed decades ago, we have to ask why his diagnostic tools are seeing a resurgence among modern economists. The answer starts in 2008. The global financial crisis exposed the fragility of unbridled free markets, re-legitimizing the classical Marxist critique of extreme economic disparity. We see this clearly in the work of contemporary economists like Thomas Piketty, who aggregates massive data sets to track global wealth inequality. This chart demonstrates Piketty's central finding. The rate of return on capital consistently outpaces overall economic growth. It is a direct mathematical echo of Marxist theory of surplus value, confirming that the system inherently consolidates wealth at the top. Today, algorithmically driven social media functions as an ideological state apparatus. Like Althusser's schools, these platforms categorize the user, mirroring his concept of interpolation, and reward behaviors that align with consumerist logic, until the capitalist hierarchy feels like a natural extension of the self. Employing a Marxist lens today requires a dual-layered analysis, tracking the hard economic data of wealth divergence while simultaneously dissecting the cultural mechanisms used to maintain that gap. The systems of production have evolved far past the industrial loom, but as long as capitalism continues to adapt its survival mechanisms, the Marxist architecture of dominance remains a tool for mapping its mutations.